Hey guys, welcome to the second installment in How It Could Have Been a Masterpiece, where I dissect, review, fix, and potentially rewrite each Thomas special in order, and now we're on the second film in our journey following Calling All Engines, and the final model series film, The Great Discovery. Now, I have a special soft spot for this one. I've always thought it was pretty great, and over the years I've come to appreciate it more, and now I enjoy it more than I ever did before, especially after this review. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. I've been so excited to go through this one with you guys because of that, as well as the fact that after Calling All Engines, every other special is, while not always better, much more interesting and has much more to talk about. So let's do it. Also, I'm sorry if my voice sounds a little nasally. My allergies are bad, but I wanted to get this video out as soon as possible, so that's why. Plot summary and background. After getting lost during an important job, Thomas discovers a hidden town in the hills with quite a history behind it, leaving everyone on Sodor ecstatic. After hearing the news, everyone quickly rushes to rebuild the town in time for Sodor Day, the island's namesake holiday dedicated to celebrating its inhabitants and culture. Thomas is enthralled to help in the process, but when a new engine comes to take over his branch line while he's busy, Thomas's ego gets the better of him, and everything in his life begins to slowly fall apart. Can Thomas make things right and help build the town in time for Sodor Day? You find out in this movie. So of course, like I mentioned earlier, this special is the final model series special, as well as the final completely model series piece of Thomas we ever got, excluding season 12 due to its semi-implementation of CGI. And because of that, it served as quite a momentous occasion for the series, and feels like a cinematic celebration and a grand finale to the model era. And for that, and many more reasons I'll get into, it's very, well, special and honestly pretty great. It also introduces Stanley, who's, pretty cool. But again, we'll get into him later. Additionally, this is the first and only time that Thomas is narrated by James Bond himself, Pierce Brosnan, who we'll talk about in a second, but objectively, I have to say, it's pretty awesome that Hit managed to get him. It makes the special even more special to have a guest narrator. Cool. In my opinion, this film is highly underrated, and like I said, I have a soft spot for it. So background out of the way, let's start breaking it all down, and just like before, I'm going to be picking apart every single little detail in this film and discuss how I feel about it. And then at the end, I'll pitch how I'd improve it or rewrite the film entirely. So let's get started. Like with Calling All Engines, the film opens with the standard Hit era opening. Boring choice, but alright. But this time, it's narrated by the spy flick legend himself, Pierce Brosnan. Now, what do I think of his narration? It's A-okay. It's not amazing or phenomenal or anything, but it's also not bad in any way, shape, or form. It's alright at worst and great at best. I enjoy his soft-spoken, relaxed tone, which is both a good thing and a bad thing because, like how he says in the interview, he treats it like he's telling his son a bedtime story. Now, that's exactly how his narration sounds, like he's telling a bedtime story. It's nice and relaxing and has some great inflection where needed and gives some nice individual voices here and there to distinguish the characters, which I appreciate, but it can be a bit boring and put you to sleep. Now, I like to say something and compare him to other narrators. This might be a highly controversial take, but I'm not crazy about Ringo's narration. Now wait before you bring out your pitchforks! Let me explain. I love Ringo. I love his narration, his voice, and his take on Thomas overall will always be very nostalgic and special to me. But I never felt like he distinguished his voices enough, leaving many of the characters sounding the same, and if you're not listening carefully, you won't know who's talking. Sure, there's plenty of inflection, love, and care, and soul poured in on his part, and it complemented the model series well and added on to the nostalgic feel, and his narration will always be classic. But whenever I watched Carlin's narration of the same episodes, I always preferred it. He always added much more personality, distinct voices, and even more inflection and soul than Ringo did, and for that, he's my favorite narrator, but that's a discussion for another time. The point I'm trying to make is, Brosnan shares some of the same problems, and I think people are too hard on him and aren't on Ringo because, well, they grew up with him, and I don't blame them for it one bit. He's great, just flawed. But personally, I think Brosnan is on the same level as Ringo in my opinion. While Ringo might be more upbeat and inflective, Brosnan brings some more sincerity, enhances both the quiet and exciting moments, and provided a different kind of inflection in my opinion. And for that, I appreciate him. His voice can admittedly put one to sleep, but it just makes the film nicer and more relaxing than it would be with Brandon or Angelus's narration, but also more exciting than it would be too, especially when Thomas escapes the mine. And on top of that, I personally like some of his voices, especially for Thomas, Stanley, James, and Sir Topham Hatt. They're all nice and subtly different and unique. Overall, I think Brosnan's narration is overhated and underappreciated. Sure, his narration is quiet and understated, but that's part of the charm. It's relaxing and adds on to the very nice, sometimes relaxed and upbeat vibe the film has going for it, as well as the many very exciting moments throughout in his own special way. So the answer, my friends, is yes. I like his narration. Yeah, he'll never be Carlin, Morgan, or Angelus, when he was great anyway, but I'll always respect his effort, and while I do wish we got to hear more of his narration, as they did originally plan for him to take over in both dubs, I'm kinda glad they didn't because it makes the movie all the more special. Anyway, back to the film. 4:3 aspect ratio. Nice. If you want to hear more about that, go listen to the first Hick Bomb about calling all engines. The film's color grading, as it was with season 11, looks pretty great in my opinion. People criticize it and say it looks too yellow and bright, but I honestly like it for that. And for the record, it's fairly balanced in colors and just looks much more lively, and frankly, adds on to the endearing, fun feel of Thomas, and, don't shoot me for saying this, reminds me a bit of the classic series. All in all, I like this look for Thomas. The saturation can get a little annoying at times, but I like it nonetheless. As always, the music and model work are stellar, and they especially shine in this movie as the sets and musical themes are highly memorable and extremely high quality, and I'll bring that up many times in the video. Also, the title card doesn't have a special font or anything like Calling All Engines. Weird. The film opens with an introduction to a holiday known as Sodor Day, in which Sudrian vehicles and people alike all come together to celebrate their and the island's history, ancestry, and Sudrian pride in general. And now the engines and people alike are eagerly rushing to prepare for it. It's cool that Sodor has its own holiday, and the date of Sodor Day serves as the due date for the rebuilding of the town so they can celebrate its reopening on the same day. Cool. We then jump to Thomas and James racing to the wharf, not only because of their ever-present rivalry and egos, but also because a special job awaits the winner. I like that James and Thomas's rivalry is at full display here. We see it a couple of times throughout the series, and we'll talk about it more in depth when we get to the Brenner specials, and while it's not a major aspect of the film or anything, it's nice that it's here. They both have big egos, especially James, well, Thomas too, especially in this era, but more on that later, and have never gotten enough of teasing one another ever since Thomas arrived. So of course naturally they're always trying to one-up each other, but in the end, as we see later in the series, they'll always be friends, and do care about each other, even if they don't always know how to show it. Good stuff. Also, yeah, it's unrealistic for them to race, but whatever, I'm okay with it. If the unrealism isn't over-the-top stupid or cartoony and complements the story, it's fine. Also, it's played to a very catchy and short song. It's not very memorable, but it's fun and adds on to the scene. It's a cute and kind of suspenseful scene as it really portrays the race as much more exciting than it actually is and makes it all the more cinematic because to the characters, it is a big deal. Moving on. Yay! Skarloey engines! I'm so glad the Skarloey engines are in this movie. They're the best. Many of them were flanderized or changed entirely in the hit era from their original personality, and that obviously sucks, and I hate it. But I'm glad they at least used them, and as a result, many kids knew who they were, and if they liked them enough, they probably went back and watched seasons 4 and 5, where they truly shined. So yeah, just wanted to say I'm glad they're here. Duncan is given a nice little role here, as he teases and tricks Thomas into going the wrong way after feeling insulted. Plus, he enjoys teasing the big engines in general, especially Thomas. I love Duncan as is, and he's in character here, even if he should probably be more mature since it's been many years since season 4. But then again, that's the case with most characters. But then the Brenner era kind of fixed that, but we'll get into that later. But yeah, it's great to see him and I appreciate his inclusion. Also, Brosnan's voice for him is good and fitting. So obviously Thomas wins the race and is tasked by Mr. Percival to work with Duncan to deliver timber, much to his disappointment. As I said, Duncan teases him and Thomas says a rude remark about little engines, which is stupid because he's a smaller engine, but it makes sense that he let his ego get to him. As he usually does when he's around other engines with large egos. To get back at him for being pompous, Duncan gives Thomas the wrong directions and sends him down an old line, not knowing of the danger that lay ahead. Jackass! Now this scene is awesome. Thomas comes to the high bridge Duncan mentioned and realized just how high he meant. As a kid, and even now, I'm terrified of heights, so the scene with Rolling River Bridge was even more intense for me. Thomas gets scared at first, but bravely urges himself to attempt to puff across. However, as he gets halfway across, the bridge begins to shake and falls apart in front of his eyes. Thomas carefully puffs off just in time as the bridge crumbles down in front of him. Now, while it isn't as suspenseful as it used to be for me, this scene still rules and even had me on the edge of my seat this time around. Watching the bridge crumble and plunge into the ravine in slow motion is sick and super enthralling, and it's terrifying to think what would have happened to Thomas if he hadn't made it. Like with the suspension bridge collapsing, I wish I could have seen it in person. Anyway, Thomas goes back to the junction to find another way, but doesn't know that both lines are old and out of date and don't lead directly to the wharf, and unknowingly embarks on a wondrous journey of discovery. Thomas traverses forests and hills, and after emerging from some bushes, receives a huge surprise and comes across an old, abandoned, but still standing town from old Sundrian times, and gazes in awe at this marvel to behold. Now, Great Waterton is very cool and interesting in my opinion. Yeah, it wasn't in the Railway series, and maybe it should have been, blah blah blah, whatever. I like that the series came up with an entirely new location to add on to the world of Thomas, Sundrian history, and the series lore overall. Sure, they could have used something from the books, and that would have been awesome, and maybe that's a change I'll add, but honestly, I like this. It's super awesome to see a piece of Sundrian history resurface and get revealed after all these years. And Thomas served as our perspective character as we, the audience, discover a lot in this film alongside him. All in all, this scene is great and perfectly begins and develops the theme of discovery and wonder in this film. New Thomas lore is always cool, even if not always Railway series accurate, because honestly, I love the Railway series, but who cares? This is what the TV series is for. It doesn't just 100% adapt the books and do nothing else. That would be boring. It has plenty of original stories that fit in with the narrative and world. Well, in the classic series anyway, and some of the hit in a lot of the Brenner era. Further develops the characters and builds upon it all much more, and it's so much more interesting that way as you never know what to expect. All in all, Great Waterton is very cool. It's beautiful and mysterious even in its degraded state, and I have so many questions about it, some of which have been answered in fan series, which is awesome. I love the design and set pieces a lot, especially the tower, and when we see it restored to its former glory, it's very satisfying. And this helps begin Thomas's arc that started with him winning the race. As with this film, it's all about him letting his ego get the better of him, and it really starts here when he rediscovers the town and rightfully gets praised. But again, we'll get more into his arc as it progresses. But for now, I'll just say that I love Thomas's characterization and arc in this film. It truly feels like a mixture of classic, egotistical, and cheeky Thomas, and hit-era kind and naive Thomas, and it works perfectly. Although he can be all four of those things in each era, but you get the point. Thomas rushes to find someone to tell about his discovery and comes across Madge, who's nice to see. She then proceeds to spread the word to a wide plethora of characters from across the Thomas cast, to old and new faces. That's another thing I love about this film. Its cast. Yeah, it's a mostly Thomas and Steam Team-centric film, but it uses so many of the characters and props from across the whole series, and I love it so much. It's so awesome to see characters like Bill, Ben, and Arthur, and especially the Pack, who we haven't seen in years, as well as many of the newer faces. Tug said this, and I agree 100%, and that's that the team probably wanted to use as many characters and props as possible to help fully develop and realize the theme that this is a massive celebration of Thomas and its characters. It is a grand finale to the model series, and to help celebrate, as many characters and props as possible should be used, and that's just so awesome. I thought it was awesome as a kid, and I think it's awesome now. Only wish more minor characters spoke and had roles, but we'll get into that later. This movie did what Calling All Engines should have done with the cast. Word gets to Harold, who goes to tell Topham, who he finds at his mansion, confirming Topham's wealth. Cool! Topham is of course over the moon and quickly goes to find Thomas. Thomas and Topham journey back into the wilderness to find Great Waterton, as Topham praises Thomas and confirms the town's name and history, namely that it was the biggest main town on the main line in the beginning of Sodor, before Thomas came, because yes, in this timeline, although not mentioned, Thomas and his friends came after another railway closed. Likely the Sodor mainland, but Hit probably didn't know that. Maybe they did, I don't know. And a huge waterworks were nearby, and the town prospered off of it, and its residents lived happily for many years. But after it dried up, and we can assume, other towns on the island grew exponentially. So people migrated elsewhere, and the town fell into ruin. And it's revealed that Thomas and his friends have been told stories about the town, which is very cool. Well, yeah, it's a little strange and weak that we've never heard of it, but I mean, that's alright. They didn't plan the series and this film out together, and I didn't expect them to. This was the Hit era, but never mind. This is still awesome. The town is filled with such history and lore, and I love that. It's implemented so well. It's definitely a part of my headcanon, and I'm glad it's on the official map. It deserves it. And as I said, Topham's praise, as well as the praise he gets from his friends, gets to Thomas's head, which will come back to bite him later. And thus begins the effort to rebuild the town in time for Sodor Day, which Topham places Thomas in charge of. All hands are on deck as many of the engines are reassigned to assist in the effort. Similar to calling all engines with the airport, and in both films Thomas messes it up, and it's about his redemption. Oh well, it's so much better in this film, so don't worry about it. And of course, the Pack are called in, who are awesome to see. They're some of the most underrated and overlooked characters in the series. Cool. And yeah, it doesn't make sense for the Steam team to all be reassigned, and it should have been side characters. Yeah, I know, we'll get into that later, but it makes sense for it to be a Steam team film. The end. But, on the other hand, it would be really nice to see some side characters. So maybe when it comes to the Waterton project, engines such as Neville, Molly, Dennis, Rosie, and Murdoch are assigned, and are the ones working with Thomas at Great Waterton, granting them more time to shine and receive development, as well as to expand the cast and to portray a strong contrast between the Steam team and Thomas's Waterton friends to make his replacement among his close friends all the more impactful. We then come to the next song, Jobs Aplenty, and I love it a lot. It serves as a work montage of the town effort and perfectly portrays the hard labor put into the project in a solid, catchy fashion. Sure, montages aren't always effective, and it thankfully doesn't montage through the whole project. It leaves plenty more work to be done during the remainder of the film, which I respect so much, as the film could have easily montaged through it all, but it didn't. It also uses a lot of new footage and barely any stock footage, which is awesome. Really helps get you excited for the film, like it should have in Calling All Engines with that first song. It's a great choice, and a great segment that keeps the film rolling strong, and it's all played to a really great, memorable song. Moving on. In the next scene, Thomas is officially put in charge of the project, as well as finding any new locations across the old tracks, which, again, goes to his head, continuing his arc of his ego consuming him. Topham also mentions he's bringing in an engine to take over his branch line duties, but amidst this excitement and ego, Thomas is completely oblivious and pays no mind, which leads to an unwelcome surprise when Stanley takes his usual jobs. Good. Okay. So, here's a big part of the film. The newest friend in Thomas's cast, Stanley. And what do I think of him? Well, we'll talk more and more about his character, break down my thoughts about him over the course of the film, and then come to a conclusion at the end. But for now, I'll say this. He's alright. Nothing too special, but a pretty good character, and he served his purpose well. But after this film, he unfortunately faded into the background when, in my opinion, he had much more potential than people gave him credit for. A potential that many people took advantage of and realized in fan series, especially Enterprising Engines, in which I highly recommend watching Conspiracy Theories and Waterworks, which further developed Stanley's kind, laid-back but insecure boy-next-door personality, and it made me like him all the more. But in the official series itself, he's alright, but like I said, we'll talk about him more as the film goes on. He had a grand entrance though, very cinematic and well directed, as all the engines and even Cranky are excited and then impressed by the shiny newcomer. And honestly, yeah, he and his model look really great, and it's emphasized that he is bigger and stronger than Thomas, which I appreciate the emphasis on, and his silver livery kind of paints him as a white knight of sorts, setting up their one-sided rivalry and Thomas's jealousy later. And Henry's line of, "Oh my, whatever will Thomas say?" is perfect and says so much, implying that perhaps Henry thought Thomas would be impressed by his temporary replacement, or even implying that Thomas would be jealous by him. And I love that. A line that can be interpreted in different ways. Or maybe that's just me giving it more depth than it actually has. Whatever. I like it. It's a nice scene. Also, Henry's constipated ass face. Lol. Meanwhile, Thomas continues his search for further discoveries, none the wiser to Stanley's arrival, and then brags to James about the nice sheds he'll be staying in during his time in charge. But James could care less, and snootily mentions Stanley and boasts about his friendly nature, and declares he is doing Thomas's jobs well, if not implying he's doing them better thanks to his snarky tone. I love that the rivalry between Thomas and James comes up again here, as James is trying to get under Thomas's skin when he's in high spirits. A dick move, but a very James move too. Continues the arc and sets up his rivalry with Stanley, as James did kind of plant the idea in Thomas's head that Stanley may be better, which may be part of the reason why he became so jealous. But it's also of course due to Thomas's own ego, but we'll see that more later. Point is, it does get under Thomas's skin, and this is where Thomas's ego begins to rear its ugly head out from under his compassionate and cheeky shell. Thomas then runs into Stanley for the first time, but they don't speak, as he observes him having fun at the washstand with his best friend Percy. Although I think Thomas and Percy's friendship is way overstated and overdramatized in this era, and should be more grounded and realistic like it was in the classic series, it's a critical part of Thomas's character, so it hits home for this shiny, impressive newcomer all his friends seem to love come in and take Thomas's spot as Percy's main branchline friend besides Toby. Thomas sees Stanley as the bad guy, and it makes sense, and of course, we'll all come to know he isn't that at all, and is a rather nice chap, but the point is how Thomas sees him, and as a result we see him the same way for most of the film, as we don't see him interacting with the other engines or anything to make us realize how kind he is. No, it's much more subtle. We observe what Thomas observes. Stanley seemingly taking his place among his friends and workplace, and rumored to be doing a better job. And as a result, we feel what Thomas feels. Confusion and disdain. I know I didn't like Stanley at first, as I only knew what Thomas knew about him, and while it did take a little bit for the antagonization to fade in my mind, I liked him and I do still like him. But when painted in this light, it was hard to like him in this film, despite him being so kind, as he is replacing our main character. And it's ironic when we come to realize how good and kind of an engine he really is near the end of the film, leaving us all feeling a little guilty. But the one engine he thought he could still rely on is now buddy-buddy with his replacement. And although Percy had no intent or gave up on Thomas in any way, that's how Thomas perceived it. It's all done so very well, so props to Miller for it. Damn, can't believe I just said that about Sharon Miller. What is wrong with me? This of course leaves Thomas depressed and jealous, thus truly beginning his disdain and rivalry with Stanley. This is then followed by another scene where Thomas observes Stanley pulling Annie and Clarabelle, which is almost always the last straw for him when it comes to new engines. This has happened before. By this, I mean a new engine taking Annie and Clarabelle and Thomas getting jealous. And it will happen again, and it does become tiresome and generic, but it makes sense, and I appreciate the continuity nonetheless. But I'd like to say, I think we should have gotten another scene in between this and the last one, to make the encounters more spaced out and less on the nose, and leave more room for natural story and character development instead of rushing through it. It's a good scene nonetheless, just a little too soon. Maybe another scene of Thomas working with the pack and having a great time or something, only to then later see him observe this would make it all the more impactful and would leave us feeling the true gut punch that Thomas felt. But yeah, good stuff. Could have been done better, but mostly great stuff. Gordon even leaves a small comment about Stanley knowing how to have fun, further digging in the knife for Thomas. We then follow Thomas as he comes home to Tidmouth Sheds. For some reason, I thought he was going to stay at those other sheds. Anyway, he comes back to find Stanley in his berth, which is the last nail in the coffin. He has officially and literally taken Thomas's place, and the other engines just grin when they see Thomas, as if they've been laughing with Stanley so much that they've just forgotten all about him. Stanley tries to be nice, but Thomas turns sour and immediately declines, feeling that he has been betrayed by his friends, and that this newcomer likely thinks he's superior to him and wants to take his job, which we all know is not the case, but for Thomas, it was. This was what really caused Thomas to not only be jealous of Stanley, but now disdainful and resentful. I like the emphasis that the narrator places on Thomas's thoughts in this film, even going as far to say that Stanley had become everyone's best friend. Which isn't true, but again, to Thomas it is. On the nose narration, but great stuff. Thomas heads back to Great Waterton, green with envy and full of resentment, with the narrator even declaring Thomas wished Stanley had never come to Sodor. A selfish and inconsiderate remark on Thomas's part, but it makes sense and it's how he feels. Good stuff. But here's what we could do instead to make it make more sense. Perhaps, since Thomas is supposed to be sleeping at the other sheds, maybe we watch Thomas leave some trucks at Knapford, and then he passes by Tidmouth Sheds and observes Stanley laughing with his friends in his berth from there, and just like in the film, Thomas is enraged and puffs away. Thomas heads back to his sheds where Dennis, Neville, and Molly, or Rosie, or whoever are waiting, and they try to ask him about it, but he denies anything is wrong and tries to sleep, but can't, fearing that he has lost all his friends, and gazes longingly at the moon. I don't know. Maybe the point in this movie was that he no longer wanted to stay at the Waterton Sheds after James put him down about it, which I can appreciate the idea of, but for the purposes of improvement and better subtlety, we'll use my version. Thomas spends the next few scenes trying to prove himself to everyone, working his hardest, giving Jack strict orders, and overall letting his ego get the better of him, as he believes he has to prove himself. And who's to say he doesn't? He shouldn't have to, but maybe to get the attention of James and Gordon he does, but other than that, no. Of course he has nothing to prove, not even to them. It's all in his head. He's let jealousy consume him, and we're observing it firsthand. Thomas is now trying everything he can to show he is superior to Stanley, and show that, as the narrator says, and this is a great line, Thomas wanted to show everyone he could do everything, and takes advantage of his new power to boss others around, which we could have seen more of if they added another quick snippet or two of him bossing the pack around, or in my version, the other engines around, to further portray how the power has corrupted him and only worsened his ego. We're seeing Thomas fall apart, and it's entertaining, but we haven't even gotten to the best part yet. In the next scene, Thomas literally and metaphorically goes off the rails after letting his eagerness to one-up Stanley get the better of him, and he goes too fast around a bend and comes flying off of the rails. Although he shouldn't have let his ego get the better of him, it's still sad to see the beginning of Thomas's downfall, as this crash and the subsequent need for repairs leads Topham to put Stanley in charge of the project. Needless to say, that sucks, and you feel bad for him, no matter how you see it. It's a brutal gut punch of a scene, as all of Thomas's hopes are crushed as the one thing he had left going for him is ripped away and given to the worst engine it could have gone to. And his resentment grows exponentially, and his ego is more bruised than ever. The worst thing that could have happened has happened. Damn. I wish we saw Edward try comforting Thomas and serve as a voice of reason, as that could have added some more character to the scene. Plus, it feels out of character for Edward to just say nothing when one of his close friends gets into a major accident. I mean, seriously, Edward, what the Stanley then comes puffing by saying, "Bad luck, Thomas," and puffs off to Great Waterton, followed by a chorus of calls, whistles, and welcomes by his friends, further digging in the knife. Also, "Welcome, Stanley!" This leaves Thomas more enraged than ever. Thomas is fixed quickly and eagerly returns to Great Waterton. On his way, he runs into Percy, who immediately brings up and praises Stanley, much to Thomas's dismay. It sucks that the first thing he hears about is Stanley. He just can't seem to escape him, even when he's at a high. He then runs into the pack, who are also eager to please Stanley and ignore Thomas as he puffs by, leaving Thomas with feelings of emptiness and worthlessness. That's honestly something I can definitely relate to, so I feel for Thomas here. He puffs into Great Waterton and smiles at the sight of the restored station, only to find Stanley idling nearby. Topham, who's waiting on the platform, looks over, pleased, and calls Thomas over to inform him that Stanley will remain in charge. Fuck, man. That's brutal. Even if Stanley is a good engine, that sucks so hard, and it's hard to not feel bad for Thomas. He doesn't deserve that. Sure, his ego was starting to get the better of him, and he was rude and needed to be put in his place, but he doesn't deserve all of this. Brutal, man. Stanley even politely toots hello, to which Thomas replies with a quiet toot back. This shows us a small glimpse of the real Stanley, kindred spirit, but we don't know quite yet if he's really as kind as they say. I like that. I like how much the narrator gets in Thomas's head throughout this movie. Not just saying what he thinks, but questioning everything around him. And it grants us a look at Thomas's thought process and deeper insecurities. Sure, maybe it takes away a lot of subtlety, but it also adds on to the scenes and writing, and complements it all well, in my opinion. And besides, there's still a good bit of subtlety in this film, in my opinion, so I won't complain. I like it. The end. In the scene that follows, Stanley tasks Thomas with shunting trucks, and compliments Thomas's shunting skills, going as far to say, "You're the best shunter ever, Thomas." Again, we see yet another glimpse of the real Stanley, but since we're still on Thomas's side, we can't empathize with him quite yet. Thomas proceeds to shunt in an effort to show everyone how hard he works, and that he's just as good and even better than Stanley. He hates being told what to do by Stanley, and to be degraded to shunting trucks, a job he even likes, mind you, it ignites the flame even further. As a result, he decides to take it upon himself to show Stanley up and gives him too many trucks in an effort to show everyone that Stanley too is flawed and not perfect. A completely selfish, irresponsible, and simply horrid act on Thomas's part. This, my friends, is when his ego really gets the better of him, as he's consumed with rage, disdain, and despair, and we quickly shift our perception and can't quite be on Thomas's side for much longer. We want Thomas to succeed and get his job back, but not like this, right? As we know deep down, Stanley doesn't deserve this. This is very in character for Thomas, and I appreciate this writing decision for his character, as it feels like the next logical step for his character arc. So Thomas does exactly what he planned. Upon returning to pull the train, Stanley is appalled, but Thomas cheekily remarks that it won't be a challenge for someone as strong as him. So Stanley proceeds to take the train and comes across a large hill, and although he tries his hardest, the chain between him and the truck snaps. The trucks go careening down the hill and slam right into the side of the nearly complete tower, causing it to come crumbling down in a blaze of glory, much to the engine's horror. This feels like an accurate, metaphorical, and literal representation of Thomas and his life in this moment. He could have redeemed himself by working hard and showing Stanley kindness and compassion, but he just couldn't, as his ego wouldn't let him. So he does the only thing he knows and always resorts to. He plays a cheeky, and in this case, dangerous trick, and it immediately comes back to bite him in the ass, as a lot of the engine's hard work is destroyed due to his selfishness. Just like Thomas in his life, right now, the tower comes crumbling down and falls completely apart. I'd also like to say that this was the second major action scene in the film, and it's a damn good one. That's another thing. All of the action in this film is awesome. It feels like something straight out of Season 5, except turned up to the next level, and I love it for that. Perfect for ending the model era. David Minton would be proud. Perfect! Upon discovering that it was all Thomas's fault, the engines are left disgusted and enraged at their friend, who's too guilt-ridden to even speak or plead his case, of which he has none. Consequences and karma have immediately caught up with Thomas, as he loses the faith and trust of his closest friends, and is now left with nothing but guilt and sorrow. No project to be in charge of, no friends to go to, and nothing for him to do but feel guilt-ridden and ashamed, as he should feel. And although it's 100% deserved, it's always kind of sad to see this happen to Thomas, and for his life to come crumbling down, as everything leading up to this has left him full of despair, resentment, and rage, and I can understand why. Who wouldn't feel insecure and upset by someone practically replacing them, even if that's not the case in reality? And we love Thomas. He's our main character, and we want him to be back in charge and receive redemption. But this is inexcusable. The engines start to discuss among themselves why Thomas would do such a thing, and Percy is especially upset as he confirms his belief that Thomas would never do something like that. Shit, man. This scene was hard to watch. Fuck, Thomas, come on. Of course your friends care about you. Especially Percy, Edward, and Toby. You were just so blinded by anger and resentment that you couldn't see it. Anyway, the engine's honest comments and inquiries leave Thomas heartbroken and guilt-ridden, and so he puffs away to find solace elsewhere, feeling that no one wants him around anymore, which mostly isn't true. Everyone's just rightfully upset and angered. We even see Stanley observe Thomas from a distance, feeling sorry for him, further humanizing him and letting us continue to realize that he's not a bad engine at all, and it's just a big understanding and misconception, for both Thomas and us, the audience, because we only see things from his perspective in this film, which again, I love. Topham calls a meeting to inform the engines that Great Waterton might not be ready for Sodor Day, a brutal piece of news for everyone, especially Thomas. Also, this is an awesome line. Thomas had let Sir Topham Hatt down. He had let his friends down. And most of all, he had let himself down. Damn, that was good! See? When Miller wanted to, she could be a great writer, so why the fuck weren't you in the series? Thomas is of course given the silent treatment by his friends, and rightfully so. I'd like to point out that while everyone else is enraged and disgusted, Stanley and Percy are wearing sad faces, indicating something more than that. Shame, disappointment, sadness. And that's especially interesting coming from Stanley. I don't know if he's hurt more by what Thomas did, or more saddened by the thought that he made Thomas so jealous and upset that he felt he needed to embarrass Stanley. And, to be honest, it probably breaks his heart. Fuck, that hurts me. Damn, this movie is good! Also another great line. He was no longer in charge, and he felt he was no longer wanted. Perfect! While the engines at Tidmouth are fast asleep, Thomas is unable to sleep, and desperate to redeem himself, he decides to move the trucks full of rubble to another sighting, hoping that perhaps this will turn the tide with his friends, which is unlikely as it's too little too late, but I mean, it's a start. I love how the hit era looks at night. Nowhere near as good as it looked in the classic series, but I still like it. I remember it being darker and spookier as a kid, but that's probably just me. So yeah, I like how it looks. Still bright, but nice and dark at the same time. Also, there's something rather ominous about watching a tail lamp on an engine or brake van disappear into the night. I mean, seriously, look at that shit. Thomas then finds a truck sitting outside an old mine shaft and tries to move it, but accidentally shunts it too hard and it goes flying into the mine. Thomas is reluctant and a little scared to enter the mine at first, but is determined to start to make things right and find that truck. The mine is dark, desolate, and ominous, and I love it. An excellent set piece. I love this scene so much. It's an excellent action scene, and much like The Mind, a fun little roller coaster. The mystery, wonder, and discovery in this film are at full display here, and it's super effective and nice. Thomas even loses sight of the truck and decides to enjoy himself. At last, Thomas has found joy in something when he needs it most, and it's very satisfying to see. However, unfortunately, like everything else in this film for him, it comes to an abrupt end and all the fun is ripped away as he crashes through a wall at the end of the mine and falls into a pit of water, leaving him helpless and alone again, except now in a much more severe situation than ever. Now, all he can do is wait for the water to carry him to freedom. At long last, Thomas must rely on faith and hope. Faith and hope that his friends will find him, that he will find a way out. Faith and hope that he gave up on a while back after his ego consumed him. Great character arc. I mean, seriously, this is so awesome. It's creepy and kind of scary in the tunnel, so I know I'd be scared. And again, we feel for Thomas, but he must brave through. Again, of course, this all looked phenomenal, especially when he crashes through the wall and plunges into the gap. The next morning, everyone arrives for work, only to realize Thomas isn't there. Now this is an awesome detail. Guess who's the first engine to realize he's gone? Yeah, Stanley, the one engine who should be the angriest, the most disgusted, the most resentful of all the engines. Yeah, he's worried about dear old Thomas. Now that is compassion. I like to believe that he asked because he wanted to make things right with Thomas and needed to find him, but was disappointed when he wasn't there, so he asked Thomas's friends. That isn't really said, but it's implied through subtext, and I like that a lot. Nice subtlety. Well, really nice subtlety, to be honest. So the engines begin their search for Thomas, but to no avail, and we return to Thomas in the tunnel, scared and helpless, further emphasizing his fear and despair. Good. Also, the mix between the music and this shot of Thomas's backside, awesome and creepy. Again, red tail lamps. Creepy. We then cut back to the engines discussing their missing friend with Topham, with Percy declaring that he misses him, even after what he did. Cute. Thus begins the third song, and a very good one at that. Where oh where's Thomas? The first at least. There's another one by the same name in Bubba the movie, as a mass search party is dispatched to find Thomas. I like to believe that not everyone looked because some engines had to keep working, but it makes sense for many, if not all of them, to keep an eye out. But it does make sense. He is the number one engine, plus after what happened, it's very valid for everyone to be worried for his well-being. Did he run away? Is he upset? Is he okay? What happened? So all wheels are on deck, and we see a wide variety of characters from across the cast of Thomas over the years join the search. Again, putting as many models on display as possible. So, great montage, plenty of new footage too, played to a great and fairly memorable song. Also, I love that it includes a bit of him in the tunnel and the line, "He just can't say when he's coming back," with it all being kinda ironic as the song becomes upbeat in this segment despite him being in a terrible situation, and it pokes fun at him, further subtly emphasizing the tragedy and unfortunate nature of his situation. It also further pushes the mystery and wonder in this film, a little bit at least. Awesome stuff. Also, the newspaper says the year's 1955. Cool! Makes sense it would make the papers too, since all of the engines, especially Thomas, are famous across the island, England, and even the world. We then cut to Topham, who's one of the most worried, desperately searching for Thomas, and I enjoy the emphasis on that. All of the engines tiredly meet back at Great Waterton after the fruitless search. Percy declares Great Waterton to be Thomas's town, that they simply cannot open it without him, to which all the engines agree, indicating that they never gave up on him and still respect and love him no matter what. I love that. We then follow Stanley of all characters, who's one of the most worried and lost in thought. He thinks back to all the times he passed Thomas, when he pulled Annie and Clarabelle, hung out with Percy, took his spot in the shed, replaced him at Great Waterton, and received endless love and praise from all of his friends. It all clicks together as Stanley ultimately realizes the nature of Thomas's situation and is filled with guilt and sadness for it. And then he says one of the best, if not the best line in the movie, and it's one that I love so much.
Thomas isn't a bad engine. He's a sad engine.
Fuck, that line is good and hits home. Ugh! That line resonates with me so much. We all do shitty things, and more often than not, it's not out of anger, it's likely out of sadness, and that is something I can 100% relate to as someone with depression. I don't know how to describe it. I just love that line so much because it perfectly encapsulates the situation, as Stanley opts to see the good in Thomas, and doesn't focus on his ego, but instead his feelings. And it's here we finally realize Stanley is a wonderful engine with no ill will or desire to replace Thomas in any way. It was all just a big misunderstanding, and it's so sad and gut-wrenching. Especially when it dawns on him that maybe Thomas left because he feels unwanted, and maybe it's his fault. Of course, it's not at all, because again, it's just a misunderstanding. God, I love this movie. This movie does the Thomas gets jealous of the new engine plot so damn well. Dare I say better than Soda's Legend of the Lost Treasure, but we'll get to that later, and I mean, I love that movie, so that's saying something. And so in his guilt and sadness, he sets out to find Thomas, declaring he must inform him of how dearly missed he is. So sweet and compassionate. Damn. Stanley is a simple, but nonetheless great character. We then cut back to Thomas in the tunnel for the last time, as his ride nears its end. Well, almost. As his faith and hope are restored abruptly as the tunnel opens to a waterfall, and in a wildly epic, over-the-top, classic and perfectly fitting and well-executed cinematic moment, and frankly, one of the coolest moments in the whole series, Thomas comes flying across the ravine and slams into the ground of the cliff on the other side, careening down the mountain till he ultimately comes to a stop, ending his roller coaster ride and adventure at last. Luckily, right near some tracks. This was so cool, so damn awesome, so well directed. I love it. It, again, feels like something straight out of season 5 except turned up to 11, and in the best way possible. So sure, it's unrealistic, but who cares? Many of the best action scenes in Thomas are, so whatever. Don't care as long as it's effective and not too over the top like blah blah. I mean, come on, the loop-de-loop, that was just stupid. But this isn't. It's so much fun and so good and just chef's kiss. And Thomas is left unfortunately helpless again and must rely on his faith and hope. Thomas then takes the time to reflect on his actions and realizes how wrong he was. Even though he did before in the tunnel because he had plenty of time, but then again, maybe he couldn't think because he was so scared, but now he's just restating it, and that's okay. It feels appropriate after it all comes crashing down again. Stanley is almost forced to quit for the day as he needs to return to work. So before quitting, he blows his effort in search of a response from Thomas. And in one last ditch effort, Thomas blows his whistle as hard as he can. And luckily, his faith and hard effort pays off as Stanley finds him, wearing a big smile as he does so. Stanley asks if he ran away, and Thomas says he was just trying to be really useful. And look where that got him. He finally tried to do the right thing and it bit him in the ass. But ultimately, his adventure humbled him, and now he's a wiser engine. Thomas then tries his best to give the most sincere apology he can, and it's so sweet.
I'm sorry that I was horrible to you. I want to be your friend.
That's all Thomas ever wanted, to be included. And now, after everything he's put himself through, he is. He only should have asked. And Stanley, of course, being the compassionate engine he is, immediately accepts the apology and declares they will be friends. And I love the line delivery. Stanley, of course, uses all of his might and compassion to pull Thomas back on the rails, but is left exhausted afterwards and a valve bursts, disheartening him. But Thomas saves the day and returns the favor and pushes him home. Yeah, I don't know how he's still able to move, but whatever. Unrealistic as he's probably severely damaged, but you know what? Maybe he is severely damaged and uses all of his might and willpower left in him to return his new friend home. I like that. This is the beginning of a decades-long friendship, and again, I love it. And as the narrator says, he would now do anything for Stanley. Also, I appreciate they took the time to show his driver put Stanley's skull in Thomas's bunker. That's nice. And as they traverse back home, Thomas's signature theme plays, and it's very thematically appropriate. And upon making their way back, Thomas feels prouder than ever. And then, we cut to a montage of engines from all across the island spreading the news of Thomas's return. And it's so heartwarming and nice. We see so many faces we haven't seen in years, as well as faces it's always nice to see. I appreciate that the Diesels, even the ones who don't like Stevie's much, are happy he's home, as many of them probably respect him now for bringing them all together and even temporarily taming Diesel 10 and calling all engines. Now, Diesel 10 wouldn't really be that happy and wears the stupid nice face again, but I'd like to believe that he'd wear an evil grin and perhaps say a sly line like, "Our old friend Thomas is back. We'll get you someday, little Thomas," implying he's got plenty in store for Thomas, as someday he'll get him, just not today. Anywho, we get back to Great Waterton where the engines finish the last touches on the town, and the arc comes full circle as Thomas realizes both the value of himself and especially his friends, declaring to himself that he's glad Stanley came to Sodor, that he loves his friends, and that he wonders why he'd ever want to be more important than any of them, and is now prouder than ever to be with his friends. Wonderful. All signs of his massive ego are gone, and the good old, kind, lovable Thomas has returned. God, I love this movie. The tower looks awesome, by the way, better than it did before, well, obviously, and in another beautiful sweet moment, gives his job of bringing the mayor to Great Waterton to Stanley, as he saved the day in the end. He found him, he forgave him, and he never stopped caring about him, and because of all that, Thomas knows that Stanley deserves it. Awesome. And now, Great Waterton is all ready for Sodor Day, looking more beautiful than ever, and Stanley brings in the mayor, who along with Topham declared the town open, and everyone is overjoyed, pleased, and proud. But Thomas feels the most proud, the most prideful. He feels great pride for his discovery, great pride for his hard work, great pride for his growth as an engine, and most of all, great pride in his friends, his family, and his home. Thomas is an all the more humble, wise, and compassionate engine. He wanted to be the leader of the track, but has now realized he and all his friends are truly leaders of the track. And that was Thomas's true, great discovery. The end. The film ends with, the standard roll call with Stanley included, who I almost wish joined the STEAM team along with Rosie and Molly. I mean, can you imagine that? That would have been awesome. And then we get a pretty awesome rap about Thomas and his friends. And I used to think it was annoying as a kid, but over the years it's really grown on me and I kinda like it. It's a really nice end to the film and feels like a celebration of Thomas as a character, as well as the whole cast and world of Sodor, as so many characters are in the song, and I love that. There could have been even more, like maybe a quick run through a bunch of side characters, but I won't complain. That's nitpicking. Not unlike Nando V Movies' podcast, Mostly Nitpicking, which you should totally check out. I know it's ironic that it calls Thomas the leader, even after he just said they're all leaders of the track, but I mean, he's the main character and one of the best engines on Sodor, and for his redemption and journey, he deserves his own song. Also, the original name of this film was Leader of the Track, and well, now you know why, but I'm so glad it's named The Great Discovery. It's a title with a few potential meanings and subtext. I love that. Now, if you couldn't tell already, I love this film. Thomas's arc, the action scenes, the cast, especially Stanley, the directing, the music, the story, Great Waterton and the lore behind it, Brosnan's narration, everything. It's all just so wonderful. I was going to criticize the dialogue a bit because you all know how I feel about hit era dialogue. It's flanderizing, oversimplified, and talks down to kids, but honestly, here, that didn't feel like the case at all. Sure, it is still kiddie and easy to understand, but I mean, it's a Thomas film. And Thomas is for kids more than it is for adults, even if when it's at its best, it's for everybody. And personally, I feel like every piece of dialogue was carefully and thoughtfully constructed and felt necessary and fitting in almost every scene, and perfectly portrayed and complemented the story and all the characters, so I cannot complain. The dialogue is pretty good here, but it's the overall character and story writing that shine. Other than that, I have little to no qualms with this film, and I love it so much. And this analysis only made me love it more. And for all that, yes, it's a masterpiece. It's a marvelous celebration, a testament to classic Thomas, a grand finale to the Mondo series. Now, what could we fix about this film to make it even better? Improvements and changes. Now, this movie is awesome, and is honestly one of the best Thomas specials for what it is, and there honestly isn't much I would change or improve. However, this movie obviously isn't perfect, so if there were anything I'd change, here's what I'd do. These are mostly small things, and even without them, this movie is great, but it could be even better. Just as a note, these changes will probably add 3 to 5 more minutes to the runtime. First, give Stanley a larger role. Don't make him mean or anything. We can do that with Ryan in Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure. Here, the rivalry is more personal and out of jealousy, spite, and inaccurate assumptions. Maybe make Stanley have more lines with Percy at the washdown or something. Like Percy says, I haven't had this much fun with Thomas in a while, and make Stanley talk to Thomas a bit more, causing him to become angrier and more jealous, making his motivation to sabotage him with the long line of trucks to be even more personal and stronger in general. Obviously not justified, but more understandable. As I said, what we have in the film with him is very subtle and very well executed, so this is kind of nitpicky, but it would have been nice if we got even more. 2. Give Great Waterton more backstory. This is just a side thing. Like I said earlier, some people might want you to change the town to something from the Railway series. Personally, I don't need that, and I know most people don't, but I just wanted to throw it out there. I love that we're introduced to a completely new TV series original location, and it feels so perfectly in line with the Railway series, as perhaps it was the original stomping ground for one of the original railways on Sodor before Topham. Now that's interesting, and I like it how it is. And although I wish we learned even more, that could have been saved for another episode. Maybe in the movie Topham could have said, "Before our railway opened, there were other railways on Sodor, and this was the main station for one of them. The engines carried passenger trains and trucks from here to Knapford, or Vickerstown, whichever. There's even an old mine around here." Adding a bit more context and background to the film than before, even setting up the mine scene later. Maybe when Thomas stumbles upon the mine, he says, "This must be the mine Sir Tom Hatt mentioned. I wonder if there's anything inside." Maybe he even sees the old scrap remains of an engine in the flooded tunnel. I don't know, I'm just throwing out ideas. 3. So basically, expand the cast. Make the engines working on the project with Thomas more minor characters like Rosie, Molly, and Neville, or Dennis, to both give roles and development to new underdeveloped characters, as well as to build a contrast between them and the Steam team, to make it all the more impactful when Thomas observes Stanley with his closest friends. They would have had some lines, and they don't have to be super major or anything, but they'd have a fair presence in the film, and it would have been nice. And if they expanded the cast a bit more, and would have made more sense for them to work on it with Thomas, and not the Steam team, as they have their own specific jobs, while these guys mostly do whatever random job Topham gives them. Plus, it'd keep them relevant, and maybe even keep them popular for a few more years, and set up further, more major appearances. Again, just an idea. 4. Expand Thomas's jealousy. I mentioned these earlier, but I'll review them just to clarify. Add a scene after Thomas's first encounter with Stanley, such as Thomas working with the pack and having fun, preceded by the scene with him and Gordon watching him with his coaches to make it more impactful. Instead of Thomas going to tin the sheds to see Stanley take his place, as it doesn't make sense since he declared he would be staying at the Great Waterton sheds, have him drop some trucks off at Knapford or Tidmouth, and on his way out, he observes Stanley from there and his reaction is the same. He then goes back to the sheds where Neville, Molly, and co are waiting, and doesn't talk about it, but is clearly upset. Makes it more subtle and more logical, but then again, it works as is, but I would have liked to see it get a bit more expanded upon. After Thomas gets upset about Stanley at the sheds, the next day he wants to prove himself, show Thomas bossing around the pack and other engines at Great Waterton to further emphasize and portray his ego and desperation to one-up Stanley, as it would, again, make it more impactful. 5. Give Edward a bigger role. He doesn't really do anything in the film, but I would have loved to see him praise Thomas after the discovery, try to comfort Thomas after the crash, later tell Thomas he has nothing to prove, only to be disappointed after he sabotages Stanley. Maybe Thomas says earlier to Edward that he likes being the leader, as it makes him feel respected and important. And maybe Edward says a line like, "You're a leader, Thomas, and if you want to be a great leader, it's not about being the best or better than anyone. It's about doing what's right and showing compassion and getting the job done. So don't forget that." Setting up and tying into the whole Thomas, you're the leader thing, and the theme of him being in charge of Great Waterton, and the ego arc, and the leader of the track thing at the end. And then, of course, like he is in the movie, Edward would be at Great Waterton and would have been both ecstatic, thankful, and then proud to see Thomas return and have made amends with Stanley. And he tells him this, or just looks at Thomas proudly, and Thomas knows and realizes the same lesson he learned in the film. I love the arc he has in the film, as it's much more subtle and, again, very well executed, but maybe with a little more context to the whole leader thing and someone to guide Thomas, and he gets thrown off but redeems himself to him and everyone else, it would have been even better. Maybe it's a little more on the nose, but again, it's just an idea. And guys, I think that's it. Like I said, this movie is so wonderful the way it is. And while I would have liked to see some of these changes be realized in the film, this movie is astoundingly great and, well, a masterpiece, just the way it is. Thank you all so much again for watching, and next time, we're finally going to get into the world of Thomas and CGI, which I'm very excited about. Even though the next 2 movies after the next one suck, and we only really get into the great CGI movies with Blue Mountain Mystery, then Tale of the Brave is King of the Railway is just okay, but whatever. But Year of the Rails also has a special place in my heart, and I can't wait to talk about it with you guys. So I'll see you all in the next one. So long, my friends. Bye-bye.